Howard Solintis and the Stolen Blade. Chapter 1. The Great Thievery. Lightning roared threateningly as clouds invaded the night sky. A stranger in a black suit strolled, doubting anyone was watching him. He stopped at the museum, then walked towards the door. He knew it was locked, but he wasn't here just to look at a few stuff. The stranger pulled out a knife from his pocket and turned it in the keyhole. The lock clicked open. Then the door gave a creak and opened. It was dark inside. He switched on the torch. He explored the museum. Suddenly, he spotted a sharp silver material. He punched the glass, and it broke into tiny pieces, showering on the floor. He grabbed the blade. The handle was of pure gold. All of a sudden, an alarm rang and red lights flashed everywhere. Hurried footsteps were heard, coming closer. Now he was far away from the door, but an open window was close by. Dropping the torch, sword in hand, he jumped out of the window. Chapter 2. Torch Clue. Howard Solintis woke up to the piercing sound of his cell phone. He groaned and picked up. "Quick, Howard, there has been a thievery at the museum," a hasty voice said. "Be right there," Howard replied, hanging up. He stumbled out of bed. He was so worried that he almost forgot to get dressed and put on his jacket. It was -4 degrees Celsius outside. When he was walking, his hands felt like they were ice, even inside his very warm gloves. A warm voice welcomed Howard into the museum. "Howard!" Mr. Graff smiled. "Hey," Howard said, taking his gloves off and rubbing his hands together. "So, what was stolen?" Mr. Graffit's face darkened. Then he pointed at shattered glass. "King Claudius's sword," he said gloomily. "How did he get in?" Howard asked. We don't know," Mr. Graffit replied, looking guilty. "Did he leave any clues?" Howard asked. "Just a torch," Mr. Graffit said, pulling out a scarlet torch from his left pocket. Howard took it from his hand. The surface was cold. "All right, I'll go investigate it," Howard said, running towards the door. Hey! Mr. Graffit cried after him, but it was too late. Howard was already gone. Chapter 3. The Three Suspects. When Howard reached home, he sat there with a torch like he was solving an impossible Rubik's Cube. Suddenly, he spotted something on the torch's handle. It was a circular sticker, and Howard dashed to Max J's shop and hastily asked the friendly shopkeeper, "Can I have a look at your CCTV, please?" The shopkeeper led him into the camera room without another word. Howard sat there for what seemed like hours and hours. He had almost finished looking at the whole of December's recording. January had only just started. After a few minutes, he found 3 suspects who'd bought the same type of torch as the thief. Now, he just needed to find out of the 3 suspects who was the thief. Chapter 4. Mr. Hennevath. He had seen the time that the suspects had bought the torches, and luckily they had all paid by credit card. So Howard called the bank and asked them to investigate who used their credit cards at those times in Max J's shop. After a few minutes, he got a call back telling him who bought them and their door numbers. He had binoculars to see in Mr. Strolly's, Mr. George's, and Mr. Hennevath's houses from his house. Mr. George was looking tired and he was watching something on the TV apparently. Nothing suspicious was going on. After another hour, he looked towards Mr. Strolly's house. He was a jolly man who loved hamburgers. In fact, he was munching on one now. He was sitting on his comfortable sofa. His face was tiny, but his belly was as big as a drum. Howard peered suspiciously through his binoculars at the stubby man's house for another hour. Again, nothing suspicious. After that, he turned his binoculars to Mr. Hennevath's house. Mr. Hennevath was a thin, gangly man with a huge, thick black moustache that clearly didn't suit his face. He was mumbling to himself and frowning. He looked almost as if he was looking to see if anyone was watching him. Howard glared, super suspicious now. Then Mr. Hennevath pulled out something from a corner. It was a blade, the sword of King Claudius. Howard gasped. It looked mesmerizing, shining in the sun. Howard rushed to Mr. Hennevath's house. He knocked on the door. The gangly man appeared at the doorstep, frowning menacingly. "Whoever you are, I suggest you get lost," Mr. Hennevath said instantly. But instead, Howard barged inside, almost knocking Mr. Hennevath off his feet. Chapter 5. Mr. Hennevath taken into custody. Mr. Hennevath growled with anger. "Just checking on a few things," Howard said, looking around the room curiously. "Get out!" Mr. Hennevath shouted. Howard ignored him and travelled further into the house. "You do not have the right to break into my house like this," Mr. Hennevath cried furiously. "Firstly, I am a detective, and secondly, I'm not breaking into your house. So, what are you going to do? Arrest me?" said Mr. Hennevath defensively. "If I have to," Howard said calmly. Mr. Hennevath's turned scarlet. Then, when Howard reached out to open the room's door, Mr. Hennevath pressed himself against it and growled to not go into that room. But Howard just pushed him aside and entered. Perched on the wooden table lay a mesmerizing blade. Howard rushed toward King Claudius's sword as Mr. Hennevath pulled out a gun Howard hadn't noticed before. Sword in hand, Howard hid behind a wooden chair as 3 shots were directed at him. Suddenly, he spotted the open window that he used to watch Mr. Hennevath through, and luckily, they weren't very high from the ground. Howard took a deep breath, and as soon as he ran to the window, Mr. Hennevath fired. But luckily, Howard had already safely jumped from the window. Howard dashed to the museum, not letting anything stop him. He had to warn the police. When he reached the museum, he panted for breath. "You've found the sword," Mr. Graffiti said, smiling widely like a Cheshire cat. "And the thief?" he asked, tilting his head. "Mr. Hennevath," Howard said, "door number 623. "All officers in house 623, Mr. Griffith informed. All the officers marched off with their guns. "I need a sword," Howard said. Why?" "Quickly," Howard interrupted. Mr. Graffiti sighed and placed it on his hand. Then Howard took off like a rocket. Crash! Mr. Hanovath's bullet narrowly flew past the officer. All officers had their guns pointed at Mr. Hanovath. Mr. Hanovath was heading towards his back door. If he reached there, it would be too hard to catch him. No! He had reached behind the door when suddenly a long silver material emerged from behind it. It was Howard, pointing King Claudius's sword at Mr. Hanovath's throat. Mr. Hanovath raised his hand and growled. Mr. Hanovath was sent to jail, and Howard, he solved a mystery barely anyone could solve.